UN Secretary General has warned that the war in Ukraine is increasing the risk of a global food shortage unless Russia releases grain stored in Ukrainian ports for export. Speaking at a UN summit in New York, Antonio Guterres said the Russian invasion has compounded food insecurity in poorer nations due to rising prices. The conflict has cut off supplies from Ukraine's ports, which once exported vast amounts of cooking oil as well as cereals such as maize and wheat. This has reduced the global supply and caused the price of alternatives to soar. Global food prices are almost 30% higher than the same time last year.
The Russian invasion in Ukraine is amplifying and accelerating all these factors: climate change, COVID-19, and inequality. It threatens to tip tens of millions of people over the edge into food insecurity, followed by malnutrition, mass hunger, and famine in a crisis that could last for years. But let's be clear, there is no effective solution to the food crisis without reintegrating Ukraine's food production as well as the food and fertilizer produced by Russia and Belarus into world markets despite the war.
Every driver of the crisis that we'll discuss today has been made worse by President Putin's war of choice.
Failure to open the ports will be a declaration of war on global food security, resulting in famine and destabilization of nations, as well as mass migration by necessity. It is absolutely essential that we allow these ports to open, because this is not just about Ukraine. This is about the poorest of the poor around the world who are on the brink of starvation as we speak. So I ask President Putin, if you have any heart at all, to please open these ports. Please assure everyone concerned that the passageways will be clear so that we can feed the poorest of the poor and avert famine, as we've done in the past when nations in this room have stepped up together to the call of action to prevent catastrophe from year after year. It's hard to believe that Ukraine, a nation that grows enough grain to feed 400 million people, is now out of production.
Come on this, let's bring in Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, who joins us from London. How do you see the UN Secretary General's warning affecting African nations?
In a big way, and it's already impacting. In fact, I was in Lagos a couple of weeks ago, and I know how food prices have shot up there, bread in particular, by at least 30%. Russia and Ukraine, the biggest exporters in the world of wheat, maize, and cooking oil, and a lot of that goes to African nations, and especially in the north of Africa, huge consumers of Russian and Ukrainian wheat in Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and all along that North African coast. So the crisis is already upon us, pushing prices up, wheat up at least by 30%, cooking oil by 50%. And this is really having a huge impact in a lot of Africa, and especially in the east, where in Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia, they're already suffering the worst drought in 40 years, and 23 million people are already facing starvation in the east of Africa. So this could not have come at a worse time. And I heard those pleas on those clips for Russia to open the ports. The problem is that the Black Sea is blockaded at the moment by Russian ships, and nothing can get out. Some wheat can go through the land borders from Ukraine into Poland, but it's just a trickle and nowhere near what the world needs. And in fact, the World Food Programme summed it up earlier today by saying that the impact of the shortage of wheat and maize could affect 400 million people throughout the world. We really are facing a crisis here, and I'm not sure that the politicians in Western capitals like London and in Washington, they don't seem to be taking this thing seriously and talking about the crisis that the world faces at the moment. These are really difficult days, because I can't see Putin moving his ships anytime soon, because it gives him power, it gives him control, and that's just what he wants.
Very well said. Now, John, any further news today about Ukrainian fighters from Mariupol now in Russian hands?
There's a lot of news today, but it's all very confusing. The Russians say that they've now taken into custody and put into prison camps 1,000 prisoners, and that there are 1,000 left. Now, we always assumed the maximum number of Ukrainian fighters that were fighting and maintained a valiant defense of the steelworks of Mariupol and fought there for 80 days. We thought that they were all out, but now the Russians are saying that there could be at least 1,000 more left. Look, in that part of the world and in wartime, getting accurate figures is sometimes very, very difficult. So we'll have to see how things develop in the coming 24 hours or so. But one has to have concern for some of the prisoners, some soldiers taken prisoners by the Russians, especially those members of the Ukraine's Azov battalion who have allegedly links to fascist groups in Ukraine. And I can see sometime in the future, in the months to come, a possible show trial in Moscow for these men, because Putin, the whole raison d'etre of Putin was to, this special military operation was to cleanse Ukraine of its Nazi elements. So it would be very much in Putin's interest to put these men on trial. But as I say, we'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
Now, meanwhile, a former U.S. president made a terrible gaffe about Ukraine. But before we ask you about that, John, let's hear those comments from George W. Bush.
Contrast. Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway. 75.
John, can you very briefly give me your reaction to that?
That was George Bush Jr. talking in Dallas last night, and a delicious misspoke clip there by George Bush, because, of course, it's coming up to the 20th anniversary of the US-led invasion of Iraq next year. And there are many critics of Bush who led the invasion because it was based on the false premise that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and the invasion should never happen. Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction. So that clip's going to haunt Bush, I should say, for the rest of his days. And there'll be documentary makers right now working on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War who will have got that clip right at the top of the right at the top of the program, guys.
Rest of his day sounds just about right. Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.